Yesterday we started talking about polynomial functions and their graphs. So like I said yesterday, we're going to actually graph these on the calculator by using a table of values, and then we'll talk about certain parts of the graph. So we talked about this chart yesterday in your notes. An even function is the end behavior, both arrows are either going up into the positive infinity and y, or if it's an even function and it's negative, it's going to go down and both arrows will face downward. And an odd function, it's either going to be the arrows are in both opposite directions. So one goes up, one goes down. So that's how you can kind of predict what your graph's going to look like. So the odd function with a positive a value in front will be in quadrants 1 and 3, and an odd with a negative coefficient in the front will be in quadrants 2 and 4. So we are going to graph this function. Looking at this leading one, it is a degree 4, which means it is an even function, and it's negative, which means it faces downwards. So you're going to have something that has the arrows pointing down on both directions. So it says by making a table of values. So here's where you need to use your calculator. So I have my calculator here. Make sure you clear the memory. We're going to go to the y equal button and type this in. So negative x to the 4th plus x to the 3rd plus 3x squared and plus 2x. So you put that in y equals. Now if you click the graph button, it will show you a sketch of what the graph is and what it should look like in the end. And for you to graph this accurately on your notes, you need a table of values. So go second graph to look at the table. Now if you scroll up and down here, you're going to see that there's small values here in the center, -1 and -1, 0, 0, 1, 5, 2, 8, and then after and before that is very, very big numbers. Our grid on our notes is only a 10 by 10 graph, so we need to change the settings of our table. So we're going to go second window, which gets the table setup menu. Let's start at like -2, and instead of counting by ones, let's change them to halves, and then go back to your table. So now you see some smaller numbers that you can graph. You got -1.5 and about -4.7 if you round it. -1 will fit on there, and so forth, probably the whole way up to 2.5.3. Okay, so if you make that graph or table chart on your notes, it's going to look like this. So you have these ordered pairs here, and if you plot them correctly and carefully and curve it, it should look something like this. Both arrows are facing downward because it was an even function. Try to connect them with a smooth curve and not straight lines like a linear graph would be. Alright, our next one is a function x to the 4th, so it's a degree 4. It's also an even. Notice it does not have a negative in front, which means its end behavior, its arrows are going to go up to the positive y infinity. So you can go back to your calculator, go back to y equals, clear that out, and type in this polynomial. Now you can use the half points, or this one will fit on your graph. So we got x to the 4th minus x cubed minus 2x squared plus 4x minus 6. So if you go here, you can see some values, but if I change the settings to go from -2 and count by ones and view the table, you're going to see you have some points here, the 2, -10, -6, -4, and 2. You can graph those on your 10 by 10 graph. So if you go back here and do a chart, these 5 points should be enough, but you can also go back to your calculator and hit graph so you know what the graph should look like. Kind of looks like a weird W, which is what this one looks like. Alright, next, locate the zeros of a function. Determine consecutive integer values. So remember, an integer is a positive or negative whole number. The values of x between which each real zero of that function is located. So when we talked yesterday, we said the zeros and the degree is where it passes the x-axis. So that's what we're looking for. What point does that pass the x? And it's going to be in between values. So that's why it says determine which two integer values it's going to be in between. So this is an odd function, which means it's going to, one arrow is going to go up and one arrow is going to go down forever and ever. It has a positive a value. So if we look here, it's going to be in quadrants 1 and 3. So if you type that in your y equals, get a table of values, and graph them, you'll see it's going to look like this. It crosses here in 3 spots. So to kind of estimate where that is, you can look at these values. So the first one is somewhere between 0 and -1, and you can see that the y value changed sign. It went from a negative to a positive, which means it crossed the x-axis. The second one is between +1 and +2, and the sign changed again from a 1 to -1, so it crossed the x-axis there. And then lastly, between 2 and 3, because the sign changed again. So anytime it changes from a positive to a negative on your y values, that's how you know it crossed the x-axis. So our solutions are between -1 and 0, between 1 and 2, and between 2 and 3. There's also maximum and minimum points. So when it swerves and curves, kind of like a roller coaster, you have a lowest point, which is right here, where it changes direction, and you have a highest point when it goes back down. So you have a max and a min. So let's look at an example. So this is an odd function, and it's positive, which means it's going to go up and down in quadrants 1 and 3. I need to estimate the x-coordinates where I have a max and a min happening. So you could type that in your y equals again, get a table of values, and graph it. So you're going to see this. Its highest point on the curve occurs at 3. So you can see that. That's your max. And then the lowest point is down here. It kind of goes off your graph a little bit, but the lowest y value is a -12. So that's your minimum value. So at what x coordinates is that? Your correct answer would be that occurs at when x is 0 and when x is 3. So that's the lesson. You don't have to worry about this part of your notes. We'll talk about that later. So the sub should be passing out your homework. There's 4 graphs based on this lesson that you just watched, and then some quiz review questions. Tomorrow we'll go over the review questions, and then we'll take your quiz.